April 18, 1942. Somewhere in the gray churn of the North Pacific, roughly 650 nautical miles east of Japan, the aircraft carrier USS Hornet rolled through heavy seas. The weather was miserable. Rain fell sideways. Winds gusted past 20 knots. Waves crashed over the bow. The flight deck, just over 800 feet of wet steel, held 16 B-25B Mitchell bombers, chained in a staggered line stretching from bow to stern. The tail of the last aircraft hung out over the fantail, suspended above the ocean. These were Army bombers, land planes. They had been designed to operate from runways measured in thousands of feet, runways made of concrete, runways that did not heave beneath a pilot's wheels. No B-25 had ever flown a combat mission from a carrier deck. No doctrine in any Air Force manual anywhere in the world described this operation as sound, because no one had ever attempted it before. The first aircraft in line sat at the front of the deck with its nose pointed into the wind. Its pilot had roughly 467 feet of takeoff distance. That was less than a tenth of a normal runway. The aircraft weighed over 31,000 pounds, loaded far beyond its rated maximum with bombs and fuel. Every calculation said it should be too heavy to fly in that distance. Every instinct said the ocean was waiting. The deck crew had painted 2 white lines on the flight deck, one for the nose wheel, one for the left main gear. If the pilot held his wheels on those lines, the right wingtip would clear the carrier's island superstructure by 6 feet. 6 feet. The width of a man lying down. One gust of crosswind, one moment of drift, and the wing would strike steel. Sailors stood along the edges of the deck, watching in silence. Many of them had seen carrier operations before. They had watched Wildcats and Dauntlesses roar off into combat, light and fast, built for exactly this kind of violence. But no one aboard had ever seen anything like a twin-engine Army bomber straining against its brakes on a pitching flight deck in heavy weather. The aircraft looked enormous in that space. It looked wrong. The engines came up to full power. The airframe shuddered. The wind-driven rain streaked across the cockpit glass. Somewhere behind and below the deck, the carrier's own aircraft sat folded in the hangar bay, crowded aside to make room for this impossible cargo. The Hornet's own planes could not launch. Her flight deck belonged entirely to these 16 olive-drab bombers and the 80 men inside them. The deck officer watched the bow. Timing mattered. A carrier launching aircraft turns into the wind and uses its own forward speed to add airflow over the wings. The officer waited for the right moment in the pitch cycle, the instant when the bow began to rise. If the pilot released his brakes as the deck angled upward, the aircraft would have a few extra degrees of lift as it left the edge. If he released too late, the bow would already be falling, and the aircraft would roll off the end into a descending slope aimed at the water. The flag dropped, brakes released. The bomber lurched forward, engines screaming at full military power, accelerating down the wet deck with its nose wheel tracking the painted white line. The distance vanished in seconds. The edge of the flight deck rushed toward the aircraft, and then the wheels left the steel and there was nothing beneath them but the gray Pacific. The bomber was witnessed to have dipped almost to the water before pulling up. For a long, terrible instant, spray from the wave top seemed close enough to touch the belly of the aircraft. Then the nose came up. The engines held. The B-25 climbed slowly, heavily, banking into the rain, turning west toward Japan. Behind it, 15 more bombers waited. One by one, they would follow. The men inside them did not know if they would survive the takeoff. They did not know if their fuel would last. They did not know what was waiting for them over the target or over China, where they were supposed to land afterward. They only knew that 4 months earlier, the Japanese had struck the American fleet at Pearl Harbor. And since that morning, the United States had been looking for a way to strike back. This was the way. It did not look like a plan. It looked like desperation. But desperation in war sometimes becomes the only honest form of innovation. What happened next would not change the map. It would change something harder to measure. It would change what both sides believed was possible. 4 months and 11 days before the first B-25 rolled down the Hornet's deck, the world had shifted on its axis. December 7, 1941. A Sunday morning in Hawaii. The American Pacific Fleet lay at anchor in Pearl Harbor, arranged in neat rows along Battleship Row as if for inspection. The Japanese attack killed 2,390 Americans, crippled numerous ships, and destroyed several others, including the USS Arizona. The shock was total. Not just military shock, though that was severe. The United States lost or badly damaged 8 battleships, 3 cruisers, 3 destroyers, and nearly 200 aircraft, most of them caught on the ground. But the deeper wound was psychological. America had believed its oceans made it safe. America had believed that an enemy thousands of miles away could not reach its military heart in a single morning. Both beliefs died before noon on December 7th. In the weeks that followed, the news only got worse. Japan moved with a speed and coordination that stunned. Allied commanders across the Pacific and Southeast Asia. Wake Island fell. Guam fell. Hong Kong fell. The Japanese invaded the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies in rapid succession. The war situation in the Pacific was growing increasingly dire. The Dutch East Indies and Burma had fallen to the Japanese, and the Philippines were on the brink. Singapore, the supposedly impregnable British fortress, surrendered in February 1942, the largest capitulation in British military history. Everywhere, the pattern was the same. The Allies fell back. Japan advanced. For American civilians, the experience was disorienting in a way that is difficult to reconstruct from this distance. War had come not as a gradual escalation, but as a sudden, humiliating blow. Newspaper headlines carried nothing but defeat. Gold Star banners began appearing in windows. Coastal cities enforced blackouts. Rumors of Japanese submarines off California spread through port towns and refused to die. The American public wanted retaliation. The pressure was not subtle. Admiral Ernest King was bombarded by the American public with the question, "Where is the Navy? And why don't they do something?" Congressmen demanded action. Newspaper editorials demanded action. The national mood was a volatile mixture of grief, anger, and helplessness, and all of it pointed in one direction: hit Japan. But hitting Japan was not a simple proposition. It turned out to be a difficult assignment. The Army Air Forces had no bases in Asia close enough to reach the Japanese home islands with existing bombers and return safely. The Navy's carrier-based aircraft had an operating radius of roughly 300 miles, and a carrier could not safely steam that close to Japan. Army bombers, however, had more range. The problem was geometry. Japan sat behind a vast moat of ocean, defended by distance itself. American heavy bombers, the 4-engine B-17 and the emerging B-24, could not reach Tokyo from any friendly base in the Pacific. The island chains that might have served as staging points were either in Japanese hands or too far away. China was an ally, but the logistics of basing a bombing force there in early 1942 were staggering. The Soviet Union, which shared a border with Japanese-held Manchuria, was neutral in the Pacific War and unwilling to provoke Tokyo. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, in a meeting at the White House on December 21, 1941, expressed to the Joint Chiefs of Staff that Japan should be bombed as soon as possible to boost public morale. The president understood something that pure military logic sometimes obscures. In the early months of a war fought after a catastrophic surprise, morale is not a luxury. It is a strategic resource. A nation that believes it cannot fight back will begin to fracture. A nation that sees proof of its own reach, even a small proof, will hold together. Roosevelt's directive was clear. But clarity of intent did not solve the problem of physics. Japan was too far away, and America did not have the tools to bridge the gap. Not the conventional tools, not the ones that already existed in the manual. What America needed was a tool that had never been built before, an idea so strange that it had no precedent, no doctrine, no training program, and no guarantee. It needed someone willing to look at the impossible and say, "We can try." Subscribe if you want more hidden World War II histories told carefully. In Tokyo, in the early months of 1942, the question of whether the Japanese homeland could be attacked from the air was not a matter of serious debate. The answer, as far as Japanese military planners were concerned, was no. Geography said no. Distance said no. The strategic situation said no. And so the planning moved on to other things. This confidence was not arrogance in the crude sense. It was a calculated assessment based on real factors. Japan is an island nation separated from its nearest major enemy by thousands of miles of open Pacific. Americans had no bases within bomber operating range of Tokyo, and planes typically used with carriers did not carry enough payload to cause enough damage for such an operation. The nearest American territory of any size was Hawaii, over 3,000 nautical miles to the east. The Philippines, which might have served as a forward base, were falling to Japanese forces. Wake and Guam were already gone. Australia was too far south. China was too chaotic. Its airfields too primitive. Its supply lines too fragile. Japanese naval strategists had constructed what they called the defensive perimeter, a vast arc of island bases and patrol zones stretching from the Aleutians in the north through the Central Pacific and down to the Dutch East Indies and Burma. Inside this perimeter, Japan's conquests would be consolidated. Outside it, any approaching enemy force would be detected, engaged, and destroyed long before it could threaten the home islands. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had established a defensive surveillance system using coastal patrols of smaller vessels, since Japan did not have radar as a means of early warning. Approximately 50 Japanese radio-equipped fishing boats formed the early warning surveillance network extending 700 to 800 miles offshore. These were converted fishing trawlers, small and expendable, but fitted with radio transmitters and manned by crews whose sole purpose was to watch the sea and report what they saw. Any American task force approaching Japan would have to cross this invisible tripwire. The moment it did, Japanese land-based aircraft and fleet units would scramble to intercept. The logic was sound. The mathematics were real. An American carrier, even if it somehow avoided detection, would have to close within 300 miles of Japan to launch its own aircraft, and those aircraft were single-engine fighters and dive bombers with limited range and modest bomb loads. The damage they could inflict on a modern industrial nation would be trivial. The risk to the carrier would be existential. No rational commander would trade a fleet carrier for a few hundred pounds of bombs on Tokyo rooftops. And yet, the confidence had a blind spot. Japanese planners were thinking inside a framework of known capabilities. They were measuring American reach by the aircraft they knew America possessed and the bases they knew America held. They were not considering the possibility that someone in Washington might decide to ignore the framework entirely. This is the recurring vulnerability of military logic built on reasonable assumptions. It works against an enemy who follows the same rules. It fails against an enemy who invents new ones. The walls of the Japanese defensive perimeter were strong. The picket boats were vigilant. The fighter squadrons on the home islands were ready for any threat they could imagine. But no one had imagined an Army bomber taking off from a Navy carrier. That gap between what was expected and what was possible was about to become the most important space in the Pacific War. Not because of the damage that would be inflicted, but because of the doubt that would be planted. The Japanese had prepared for every rational threat. What they had not prepared for was the irrational one. The idea arrived, as many consequential ideas do, almost by accident. The concept came from Navy Captain Francis Lowe, who reported to Admiral Ernest J. King on January 10, 1942, that he thought twin-engine Army bombers could be launched from an aircraft carrier after observing several at a naval airfield in Norfolk, Virginia, where the runway was painted with the outline of a carrier deck for landing practice. It was the kind of observation that most officers would have filed away and forgotten. Army bombers on a carrier deck. The two things did not go together. Carriers launched Navy aircraft, small and light and built for the sea. Army bombers were heavy, long-winged, designed for runways and altitude and distance. Putting one on a carrier was like putting a draft horse on a racing yacht. It did not make physical sense. But Lowe had seen the outline of that carrier deck on the runway, and he had seen the twin-engine bombers passing over it, and something in the geometry of the image had clicked. If the outline was roughly the same size as a real carrier deck, and if the bombers could take off in roughly that distance, then perhaps the impossible was merely untested. Admiral King's Air Operations Officer, Captain Donald Duncan, used some creativity to draw up a plan to borrow Army Mitchell B. 25 bombers and train pilots to fly them off carrier flight decks. The concept was simple in outline and staggering in implication. Load Army medium bombers onto a Navy carrier. Sail the carrier across the Pacific to within striking range of Japan. Launch the bombers. Let them fly west, bomb their targets, and continue on to land in China, because landing a medium bomber back on a carrier was clearly impossible. It was a one-way trip by design. The bombers would never return to the ship. The carrier would turn around immediately after launch and run east at high speed, back towards safety. The bombers would be on their own from the moment their wheels left the deck. Conceived in January 1942 in the wake of the devastating Japanese surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, the Joint Army-Navy bombing project was designed to bomb Japanese industrial centers to inflict both material and psychological damage upon the enemy. Planners hoped to induce the Japanese to recall combat equipment from other theaters for home defense, and to incite what they described as a fear complex in Japan. Doolittle, a famous military test pilot, civilian aviator, and aeronautical engineer before the war, was assigned to Army Air Force's headquarters to plan the raid. He was not chosen at random. He was a man of unusual qualifications, a rare fusion of technical brilliance and operational nerve. On September 4th through 5th, 1922, he had become the first man to fly across the United States in less than 24 hours. 9 years later, he did it in less than 12. He was first to perform an outside loop and first to take off, fly, and land blind, using only instruments. He held a doctorate in aeronautical engineering from MIT. He had set speed records, won trophy races, and helped develop high-octane aviation fuel for Shell Oil. He understood aircraft not as a pilot understands them, from the seat, but as an engineer understands them, from the blueprint. He was 45 years old, too old some thought to be flying combat, too valuable others thought to be risked. But the plan needed a leader who could bridge the gap between two services, Army and Navy, that had never attempted anything like this together. It needed someone who could speak the language of engineering, the language of command, and the language of risk. It needed Doolittle. The plan was given no official name at first. Later, it would be called Special Aviation Project Number 1. It was not called that because it was the first project on a list. It was called that because there was no precedent for it. There was no second. There was only this, a single idea, fragile and audacious, moving forward through the planning channels of wartime Washington while the news from the Pacific grew darker by the day. The first question was which aircraft could survive the attempt. Not which aircraft was best suited for carrier operations, because no Army bomber was suited for carrier operations. The question was which aircraft could be forced, through modification and will, to do something it was never meant to do. The aircraft would need a cruising range of 2,400 nautical miles with a 2,000-pound bomb load. Doolittle considered the B-25B Mitchell, the Martin B-26 Marauder, the Douglas B-18 Bolo, and the Douglas B-23 Dragon. The elimination process was swift and merciless. The B-26 had questionable takeoff characteristics from a carrier deck. Its takeoff roll was too long. Its handling at low speed, too unpredictable. A pilot trying to coax a B-26 off a pitching deck in heavy weather would be fighting the aircraft at exactly the moment he needed it to cooperate. The wingspans of the B-18 and B-23 were larger than that of the B-25, reducing the number that could be taken aboard. A carrier and posing risks to the ship's superstructure. Their wide wings would foul the island, the bridge structure that rises from the starboard side of every American carrier. You cannot launch an aircraft that cannot physically fit past the ship's own architecture. That left the B-25 Mitchell. By default, the choice was the North American B-25, a sturdy medium bomber that had entered service in 1941. It was named after Brigadier General Billy Mitchell, the early advocate of airpower, who had been court-martialed in the 1920s for his insistence that aircraft would transform warfare. The irony was fitting. A bomber named for a man punished for thinking too far ahead was about to be used in a way no one had thought of at all. The B-25B was a solid, workmanlike aircraft. Twin Wright Cyclone radial engines, each producing 1,700 horsepower. A wingspan of 67 feet and 7 inches. A crew of 5, pilot, co-pilot, navigator bombardier, radio operator gunner, and turret. Gunner. It could carry 3,000 pounds of bombs and cruise at roughly 230 miles per hour. Its range, in standard configuration, was approximately 1,300 miles. That was not enough. Not nearly enough. But the B-25 had virtues that mattered more than its raw specifications. It was honest in the air. Predictable, forgiving. It communicated its intentions to the pilot through the controls, warning before it stalled, responding cleanly to inputs, behaving the way a well-designed airplane should. For a mission that would push aircraft and crews far beyond normal limits, predictability was more valuable than performance. When planning indicated that the B-25 was the aircraft best meeting all specifications, 2 were loaded aboard USS Hornet at Norfolk, Virginia, and subsequently flown off the deck without difficulty on February 3, 1942. The test was deliberately quiet. No fanfare, no announcements. 2 lightly loaded B-25s, craned aboard the carrier, then flown off by test. Pilots who had practiced short-field takeoffs from the painted outline on the runway at Norfolk. The test pilot later recalled that when the bombers were spotted for takeoff, his airspeed indicator showed 45 miles per hour just sitting there. He needed to accelerate only about 23 more. The carrier's own forward speed, combined with the headwind, gave the aircraft nearly half the airspeed it needed before the throttles were even advanced. The physics worked. Not comfortably, not with margin, but they worked. The proof of concept was established. A B-25 could take off from a carrier. Now the question became whether 16 B-25s, fully loaded with fuel and bombs and 5-man crews, could do it in combat conditions at sea with no second chances. The crews trained at Eglin Field, Florida from March 9th to 25th, with as much secrecy as Doolittle could impose. They practiced short takeoffs, cross-country flying, night flying, navigation, and low-altitude bombing. Eglin was chosen for practical reasons. The base was near the sea so that navigators could practice over-water navigation. It had an auxiliary field for training in short-field takeoffs and was relatively secluded, free from curious eyes. What the crews found when they arrived was a stretch of Florida panhandle that felt like the edge of nowhere. Flat pine forests, sand, humidity that clung to everything. Auxiliary fields carved out of the scrub, surrounded by nothing. The five-man bomber crews came from the 17th Bombardment Group, the outfit with the most experience, flying the new B-25 Mitchell. On February 3rd, 4 squadrons were ordered to Columbia, South Carolina, where each man stepped forward to volunteer for a mission he knew nothing about. They were told only that the work would be dangerous and that anyone could refuse without consequences. None refused. A Navy instructor, Lieutenant Henry Miller, arrived from nearby Pensacola. His arrival was met with some skepticism. He was to teach the Army crews how to do carrier takeoffs as well as Navy etiquette. At that point, the group had not been told their mission would involve a carrier. Many were not convinced that a B-25 could be launched from one. The fact that Miller had never seen a B-25 until he arrived at Eglin did not inspire confidence. But he climbed into the co-pilot's seat, took the controls, and following standard naval procedure, got the bomber airborne at less than half the usual speed. He quickly won the respect of the crews. The short takeoff training became the defining ritual of those 3 weeks. Pilots and co-pilots focused on short field takeoffs. One runway was painted to simulate a carrier deck. Flags were placed as markers, with an initial goal of being airborne before 800 feet. Within a week of practice, everyone was consistently in the air by 400 feet. The technique was unnatural. The shortest possible takeoff was obtained with flaps full down, stabilizer set 3/4 tail heavy, full power against the brakes, and releasing the brakes simultaneously as the engines came up to full revolutions. The control column was pulled back gradually, and the airplane left the ground with the tail skid about 1 foot from the runway. This appeared to be an unnatural attitude, and the airplane took off almost in a stall. Despite the high wing loading and unnatural attitude, the comparatively low power loading and good low-speed control characteristics of the airplane made it possible to handle without undue difficulty. It became a competition. The winner would be Lieutenant Donald Smith, who was able to get his B-25 airborne in 287 feet, less than the length of a football field. The men pushed each other day after day, learning to feel the exact moment when the wings took the weight, the precise instant to release the brakes, the narrow margin between a successful takeoff and a stall. On the morning of March 23rd, one aircraft stalled at about 15 to 20 feet in the air during a takeoff attempt. The B-25 crashed, severely damaging the airframe. All occupants were uninjured, but the plane was damaged beyond repair and scrapped. The crash was a reminder that the margin they were operating in was not metaphorical. It was physical. 15 feet of altitude and a fraction of a second separated flight from failure. Meanwhile, the bombers themselves were being transformed. Modifications included the addition of a 265-gallon fuel tank inside a modified bomb bay. A 160-gallon rubber fuel tank was installed on top of the bomb bay. The gun turret under the aircraft was removed. A rubber fuel bag with a capacity of 60 gallons was inserted in its place. Each plane's 210-pound liaison radio was removed to save weight. These modifications would eventually nearly double the fuel capacity, from 646 to 1,141 gallons. And then there was the matter of the tail guns. The lower turret was gone. The rear of the aircraft was defenseless. 2 broomstick handles with a diameter of 50 millimeters were fashioned to resemble counterfeit machine guns. These protruded from the tail of the B-25s. Wooden sticks, painted black, stuck out of the tail cone to look like gun barrels. It was a bluff, a deception aimed at any Japanese fighter pilot approaching from behind. The hope was that the sight of what appeared to be twin machine guns would discourage a tail attack. It was desperate. It was also rational. Everything about this mission lived in the space between those two words. On April 2, 1942, the aircraft carrier USS Hornet left San Francisco Bay carrying a unique cargo of 16 Army Air Force's B-25 Mitchell bombers. The bombers filled the entire flight deck. parked in a staggered line from island to stern, their wings folded where possible, their fuselages chained to the deck against the motion of the sea. The Hornet could not launch or recover its own aircraft. Aircraft from USS Enterprise provided aerial cover for the Hornet since the latter's flight deck was fully loaded with the B-25 bombers. This was a carrier rendered operationally blind by its own cargo. If Japanese aircraft or submarines found the task force, the Hornet could not defend itself with its own planes. Everything depended on the Enterprise and the escort ships. At a secret conference in San Francisco, Lieutenant Colonel Doolittle met with Vice Admiral William F. Halsey, Jr., who would command the task force that would take Doolittle's aircraft to the very gates of the Japanese Empire. Halsey was the most aggressive flag officer in the Pacific Fleet, a man whose instinct in every tactical situation was to attack. He was the right commander for a mission that required pushing deep into enemy waters with irreplaceable ships. They agreed upon a launch point some 600 miles due east from Tokyo, but if discovered, Task Force 16 would launch planes at the point of detection and retire. The fallback plan was built into the primary plan. If anything went wrong, the bombers would go anyway, from wherever the task force happened to be. The crossing took 16 days. 16 days of open ocean, empty horizons, radio silence, and the constant low-grade anxiety that comes from knowing you are moving towards something that cannot be undone. The men lived in the compressed world of a warship at sea. The Navy crews ran the ship. The Army crews waited. They checked their aircraft. They studied their target folders. They cleaned their weapons. They played cards. They slept when they could and thought when they could not avoid it. The weather deteriorated as they moved west. Seas built. Wind increased. The Hornet rolled through swells that sent spray over the bow and across the chained bombers on the flight deck. The B-25s, designed for the dry stillness of a concrete ramp, endured salt water and corrosion and the constant vibration of a ship moving through heavy weather. There was no way to warm up the engines properly on deck. There was no way to conduct full maintenance. Minor problems that would have been routine at an airfield became sources of anxiety at sea. A fuel leak in a collapsible rubber tank, a turret mechanism that jammed, an instrument that read slightly off. Each small failure carried a weight disproportionate to its size because there was no depot, no parts warehouse, no replacement aircraft. The men who were about to fly did not yet know their specific targets. That information would be delivered at sea in classified briefings, conducted below decks with maps and photographs and target descriptions. Final instructions were given to the flight crews. Non-military targets were to be avoided at all costs, especially the Imperial Palace complex in central Tokyo. The raiders were told to hit factories, oil storage, steel works, power plants, military targets, industrial targets, not civilians, not shrines. The task force pushed west. The ocean grew rougher. The distance to Japan shrank. And somewhere ahead, invisible in the gray expanse of the North Pacific, a line of small Japanese fishing boats sat at anchor, watching the sea, listening to the silence, waiting for something that would break it. American naval intelligence did not know that ahead lay a line of approximately 50 Japanese radio-equipped fishing boats, forming an early warning surveillance network extending 700 to 800 miles offshore. In the early morning hours of April 18, 1942, the group was still more than 1,050 miles from their target when Enterprise's radar indicated two surface craft about 12 miles away. It was still dark. Halsey knew that the overcast and moonless sky kept his ships out of sight of other ships. It was dark and still half night. The decision was made to alter course, turning 90 degrees to avoid the contact, then resuming the westerly heading half an hour later. The task force moved on, but the morning brought more contacts. United States intelligence had not known about the ring of sentry boats anchored 650 miles off Japan's shores. By the time the Hornet's lookouts noticed the Nido Maru 10,000 yards away, across a rainy, cloudy sea, there was little chance the Japanese lookouts had not spotted the 809-foot-long, 20,000-ton aircraft carrier. The 70-ton patrol craft radioed an attack warning to Japan. The message went out. Whether it was received, whether it was understood, whether it prompted an immediate response, the Americans could not be certain. But the possibility was enough. The mission's secrecy, the one factor that had protected the task force across thousands of miles of open ocean, was potentially gone. The boat was sunk by gunfire from the cruiser Nashville, but sinking the messenger does not unsend the message. The warning had been transmitted. Japanese naval headquarters might already be vectoring aircraft and submarines toward the task force's position. To linger invited a Japanese attack, which would endanger essentially what was left of the United States Pacific Fleet. The Hornet and the Enterprise were not expendable assets. They were among the very few fleet carriers America had left after Pearl Harbor. Losing them would not merely end this mission. It would cripple American offensive capability in the Pacific for months, perhaps longer. The decision had to be made immediately. Doolittle and Hornet skipper Captain Mark Mitcher decided to launch the B-25s immediately, 10 hours early and 170 nautical miles farther from Japan than planned. The implications were stark. The original plan called for a launch at approximately 400 miles from Japan, close enough that the B-25s could reach their targets, bomb them, and continue on to prepared airfields in China with adequate fuel reserves. Fuel was now a major issue. The extra distance meant the bombers would be operating at the extreme edge of their range. Every gallon mattered. Every headwind mattered. Every minute of engine operation burned fuel that could not be replaced. The timing of the attack was also completely changed. Original plans called for a nighttime raid, but due to the early launch, the bombers would arrive during daylight. The cover of darkness, which would have made the bombers harder to detect and intercept, was gone. They would fly over Japan in full daylight, visible to every fighter pilot and anti-aircraft gunner on the home islands. Everything about the plan had just gotten worse. The distance was greater, the fuel margin was thinner, the element of surprise was compromised, the time of arrival was more dangerous, and yet the only alternative was to turn around, to abandon the mission, to sail home and explain to a grieving nation that the one attempt to hit back had been called off because a fishing boat had seen them. That was not an option anyone on the bridge was willing to accept. The signal went out. Launch aircraft. Doolittle took off at 8:20 in the morning, and the other 15 B-25s followed over the next hour, mostly at 3 to 4 minute intervals. The process was methodical and terrifying. Each aircraft was unchained and spotted on the deck, its crew aboard, its engines running. The deck crew worked in the wind and spray, guiding the heavy bombers forward, checking the alignment of the nose wheels against the painted white lines. The carrier turned into the wind. The deck pitched. The signal was given. The first takeoff, Doolittle's, set the pattern. Full power against the brakes. Engines at maximum revolutions. Release. The bomber surged forward, accelerating through the rain, the deck edge approaching with sickening speed. And then the wheels left the steel, and the aircraft was airborne, barely, clawing for altitude over the gray waves. Although none of the B-25 pilots, including Doolittle, had ever taken off from a carrier before, all 16 aircraft launched safely between 8:20 and 9:19. Every single one made it. 45 days of training, thousands of short takeoff practice runs on a painted runway in the Florida Panhandle, and not a single aircraft failed to get airborne from the Hornet's deck. The last aircraft had the longest takeoff roll because it sat farthest aft, with more deck available. The first aircraft had the shortest. The mathematics shifted slightly for each bomber, but the physics remained the same. Heavy aircraft, short deck, wet surface, pitching ship, headwind. Every pilot held the brakes until the engines peaked, felt the airframe straining against the chocks, and then committed to the run. All 16 aircraft took to the air safely, but a sailor lost an arm when he stepped back into the prop wash of an aircraft. That detail is rarely emphasized, but it belongs here. The deck of an aircraft carrier during launch operations is one of the most dangerous working environments on Earth. Men move in the blast of jet and propeller wash, surrounded by spinning blades and rolling metal, and the deafening roar of engines at full power. The danger was not reserved for the men in the cockpits. The B-25s then flew toward Japan, most in groups of 2 to 4 aircraft, before flying singly at wave-top level to avoid detection. Once clear of the task force, the bombers descended to the surface of the ocean and flew at mast height, so low that the spray from the wave-tops was visible beneath them. At this altitude, they were below the detection threshold of Japanese radar, which was primitive by Allied standards and largely non-existent at sea level. The flight to Japan would take roughly 6 hours. 6 hours of flying barely above the water, watching fuel gauges creep downward, knowing that the distance behind them was already greater than the distance they had trained for. 6 hours of silence, because their radios had been removed to save weight. They could not talk to each other. They could not talk to the carrier. They could not call for help. Each aircraft flew alone. The sky was overcast. The sea was rough. The world contracted to the size of a cockpit, the sound of 2 engines, and the horizon line where gray water met gray cloud. Somewhere ahead, invisible at this altitude, the coast of Japan was waiting, and behind them, the task force was already running east at maximum speed, putting distance between itself and the danger it had created. Following the launch of the bombers, the Navy task force left Japanese waters at maximum speed, which made it impossible for the Japanese forces to catch them. The carriers were safe. The bombers were on their own. The aircraft began arriving over Japan about noon Tokyo time, 6 hours after launch, and bombed 10 military and industrial targets in Tokyo, 2 in Yokohama, and 1 each in Yokosuka, Nagoya, Kobe, and Osaka. The bombers came in low. They had crossed the coast at wave height and climbed to bombing altitude over the target areas, rising to roughly 1,500 feet to begin their runs. The transition from sea level to attack altitude took only seconds, and in those seconds the crews saw Japan spread out beneath them for the first time. Factories, warehouses, residential neighborhoods, smoke from industrial chimneys, streets, people. Despite earlier worries about the Nidomaru providing early warning, the raiders encountered little defense. In total, the bombers encountered about 20 enemy interceptors and met sporadic anti-aircraft fire, but all bombers survived. The air defenses of the Japanese home islands, formidable in theory, had been configured against a conventional threat carrier aircraft approaching at medium altitude in formation. The B-25s did not fit that template. They came in low, individually, from unexpected directions, at a time when no one believed an attack was possible. 8 primary and 5 secondary targets were struck. In Tokyo, the targets included an oil tank farm, a steel mill, and several power plants. In Yokosuka, at least 1 bomb from a B-25 struck the nearly completed light carrier Ryuho, delaying her launch until November. The physical damage, viewed in the cold ledger of strategic bombing, was modest. Japanese casualties during the Doolittle raid were 50 killed and over 400 wounded, and about 200 houses were destroyed. Compared with the firestorms that would later consume entire Japanese cities, the Doolittle raid was a pinprick. 12.5 bombs scattered across a nation. A few fires quickly extinguished. A few buildings quickly repaired. But the damage that mattered could not be measured in tons of steel or square feet of rubble. It was measured in the sudden, cold realization that the home islands were not safe, that the defensive perimeter could be breached, that the enemy had found a way. In Japan, the The raid raised fear and doubt about the ability of military leaders to defend the home islands. The Japanese public had been told that the military could protect them. The military had been telling itself the same thing. The appearance of American bombers over Tokyo in broad daylight shattered that assurance. The mock gun barrels made from broomstick handles and the tail cones were described afterward as effective, in that no airplane was attacked from directly behind. The bluff held, painted wooden sticks passed off as machine gun barrels deterred real fighter pilots from making real attacks. It was the smallest deception in the history of air warfare, and it worked. The bombers did not linger. They dropped their ordnance, strafed targets of opportunity on the way, out, and turned south and west, heading for China. The attack had lasted only a few minutes over each target, 30 seconds over Tokyo. That phrase, which would later become the title of a book and a film, captured the brevity. 30 seconds, the bombs fell. The aircraft climbed and banked and disappeared over the rooftops. And Japan was left to reckon with what had just happened. The fires were put out within hours. The rubble was cleared within days. But the question, how did they reach us, would burn for much longer. The attack was the part of the mission that worked almost as planned. Everything after it was improvisation, desperation, and luck. The 15 bombers that headed for China flew southwest along the Japanese coast and then out across the East China Sea. The earlier-than-planned launch caused all 15 to run low on fuel as they approached the Chinese coast. Only a tailwind that increased the ground speed allowed them to get that far. By then, night had closed in and forced all 15 crews to ditch along the coast or bail out over eastern China around 10 at night. Unbeknownst to Doolittle, the proposed landing fields in China were not ready. The Chinese had not been told of the nature of the mission, so when bad weather struck, they decided to maintain radio silence. The homing beacons that were supposed to guide the bombers to safe airfields were never activated. The crews flew into darkness over a country they had never seen, in weather that obscured the terrain with fuel. Gauges touching empty. Of the 16 planes and 80 airmen who participated, all either crash-landed, were ditched, or crashed after their crews bailed out. With the single exception of Captain Edward York and his crew, who landed in the Soviet Union. Not one aircraft was recovered. The entire bomber force was destroyed or abandoned in a single night. York's case was a story unto itself. Without Doolittle's knowledge, and in violation of his orders, both carburetors on York's plane had been replaced by depot workers in Sacramento. The change was not discovered until the raiders were at sea, and the extra flying distance caused by the premature launch meant the B-25 had no chance of reaching the Chinese coast. York made the decision in flight to divert to the closer Soviet Union. Although York and his crew were treated well, diplomatic attempts to return them to the United States ultimately failed, as the Soviet Union was not at war with Japan and was obligated to intern any combatants found on its soil. The other crews scattered across the Chinese countryside in the rain and dark. Doolittle and his crew parachuted into China, receiving assistance from Chinese soldiers and civilians. Doolittle landed in a heap of dung, which saved a previously injured ankle from breaking. It was not a heroic landing, it was a survival landing. The kind of landing where you are grateful to be alive and willing to accept any surface that is not rock. Most of the B-25 crews who reached China eventually found safety with the help of Chinese civilians and soldiers. Farmers, villagers, resistance fighters, and missionaries guided the Americans through occupied territory, hiding them from Japanese patrols, feeding them, tending their injuries. The Chinese people who sheltered the raiders did so at extraordinary personal risk. The people who helped them paid dearly. Most of them were tortured and executed for giving aid. During the Japanese search, an estimated 250,000 Chinese lives were taken by the Japanese Imperial Army. The Zhejiang Jiangxi campaign, launched in direct reprisal for the Doolittle raid, was one of the most savage acts of collective punishment in the Pacific War. Entire villages were destroyed. Entire populations were murdered. The cost of sheltering 80 American airmen was borne by hundreds of thousands of Chinese civilians who had no part in the decision to launch the raid. Of the 16 crews, 14 returned to the United States or reached safety, though one man was killed while bailing out. 8 men were captured by Japanese forces in eastern China, and 3 of them were later executed. In addition to being tortured, the captured men contracted dysentery and beriberi as a result of the deplorable conditions under which they were confined. The 8 airmen were forbidden to give any defense and were found guilty and sentenced to death. On the urging of Prime Minister Tojo, Emperor Hirohito commuted 5 to life imprisonment. The 3 others were executed by firing squad on October 14, 1942. The remaining 5 men survived in military confinement on a starvation diet, their health rapidly deteriorating. In April 1943, they were moved to Nanjing, and on December 1, 1943, one of them died. The other 4 men survived to August 1945, when they were freed. Doolittle initially believed that he would be court-martialed for the loss of all his aircraft. Instead, he received the Medal of Honor and was promoted 2 ranks to Brigadier General. The distance between what he expected and what he received measured the distance between the military logic of the old world and the strategic necessity of the new one. He had lost every aircraft. He had damaged very little. But he had accomplished something that no amount of conventional success could have replicated. He had proved that the impossible was not. The Doolittle raid killed 50 people, damaged a few hundred buildings, and delayed the completion of 1 light carrier. By the metrics of conventional warfare, it was barely a footnote. By the metrics of strategic consequence, it was a turning point. The raid served as initial retaliation for Pearl Harbor and provided an important boost to American morale. In Japan, it raised fear and doubt about the ability of military leaders to defend the home islands. The American public, starved for good news after months of unbroken defeat, seized on the Tokyo raid as proof that the war could be fought, that the enemy could be reached, that the long retreat was not permanent. The Japanese reaction was more complex and more consequential. The military establishment could not publicly acknowledge that American bombers had reached the home islands through a gap in the defensive perimeter. To admit this would be to admit failure on a fundamental level. Instead, the response was channeled into action. The raid pushed forward Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's plans to attack Midway Island in the Central Pacific, an attack that turned into a decisive defeat of the Imperial Japanese Navy by the United States Navy in the Battle of Midway. The connection between the Doolittle raid and Midway is one of the most consequential chains of cause and effect in the Pacific War. The raid did not cause Midway. Yamamoto had been planning the Midway operation for months, but the raid accelerated his timetable and strengthened his argument within the Japanese Naval Command. The home islands had been attacked. The defensive perimeter had been shown to be porous. Something had to be done to push the Americans farther back, to extend the buffer zone, to ensure that no carrier could ever again reach launch range of Japan. Midway was supposed to accomplish this. Instead, it destroyed 4 Japanese fleet carriers and hundreds of irreplaceable aircraft and air crew. The battle broke the offensive and capability of the Imperial Japanese Navy and shifted the strategic balance in the Pacific permanently. The seeds of that shift were planted, at least in part, by 16 bombers that could not even land back on the ship that launched them. There is something in this story that resonates beyond its specific details. Something about the relationship between orthodoxy and innovation, between what doctrine says is possible and what desperation reveals. The Doolittle raid was not a conventional operation that succeeded through superior planning and execution. It was an unconventional operation that succeeded because it did something no one on either side believed could be done. The Japanese had prepared for every threat they could imagine: carrier aircraft from standard range, submarine attacks, surface engagements. They had not prepared for Army bombers launched from a carrier at extreme range, flying at wave height to avoid detection, bombing in daylight because a 70-ton fishing boat had forced the timetable forward by 10 hours. The threat was too strange to anticipate, and so it succeeded. This pattern, the pattern of a serious military establishment building defenses against the obvious threat and being broken by the unorthodox one, would repeat itself throughout the Pacific War. It would appear again at the Bismarck Sea, where skip bombing turned a convoy into a graveyard. It would appear in the island-hopping strategy that bypassed Japanese strongpoints instead of assaulting them. It would appear in the Navajo code talkers, the night fighters, the submarine campaign against merchant shipping, and a dozen other innovations born from necessity. The Doolittle raid was the first and purest expression of this principle. 80 men in 16 bombers that could never come home, launched from a ship that was never designed to carry them, into a sky that no one believed they could reach. The damage was minimal. The message was permanent. What broke the assumption was not firepower. It was imagination. And in a war that would last 3 more years and cost millions of lives, imagination would prove to be the weapon that mattered most. The bombers are gone. The carrier is gone. The men who flew the mission have all passed from living memory into history. But the lesson remains, as clear and uncomfortable as it was on the morning of April 18, 1942, when a B-25 Mitchell bomber dipped toward the waves off the Hornet's bow and then, against all reasonable expectation, began to climb. The impossible is only impossible until someone decides it isn't. And then it becomes the thing that changes everything.